Back in December of 1933, Carlos Gardel came to America to sing over NBC. I am now in the office of Mr. John Royal, who at that time was the vice president of NBC and who gave the okay for the contract of Carlos Gardel. If I recall correctly, Mr. John Royal, Hugo Mariani, who was the NBC orchestra director, went to Argentina in 1933 in the fall and was introduced to Carlos Gardel. He had known him already by reputation, but then he was so impressed by his voice that I understand he wired to you, and then you gave the okay 3 hours later.
You're quite correct. You're quite correct about that, because I had great judgment in Mr. Mariana's decisions regarding talent, and I had known about the reputation of Mr. Gardel, and when I knew he was available, I wired immediately to Mr. Mariani to sign him to a contract, and then came the reply that he would be available to come here, and it made us all very happy to feel that we were going to have this truly great world artist to come to New York.
Now, today in Latin America, Carlos Gardel's popularity has no precedence. He has, throughout Latin American broadcastings, he has programs of his records, and in many homes his picture is there along with the most precious pictures of the families, and he's remembered by everybody as by his extraordinary personality. It's been said that knowing him was liking him, and as a singer and an artist, he's still number one. Now, Mr. John Royal, what was your impression of the man and the artist?
It was not my good fortune to be personally very close to Mr. Gardel, because he was an artist and spent most of his time in the studios during his stay in New York, and he was busy with other matters, so I never really was close enough to talk about his personality. I know about his talent, which was unequaled in his line, and he was a world figure, and he will live forever. It's unfortunate that he did not remain in this country long enough for him to be as great as he really was in other countries.
You told me in another conversation interview that we had, Mr. Royal, that Carlos Gardel was ahead of his time. Could you comment that, please?
That happens frequently in world figures, and Mr. Gardel, if he were here now, would probably be greater than ever in his career. It so happens that the good Lord brings people on the earth ahead of their time, and he was ahead of his time as far as the United States was concerned. The present trend of music and entertainment would be just to the liking of Mr. Gardel and his talent and his personality. In addition to his talent, his personality was most extraordinary. He had great force of projection. He was manly, which is the most important factor today with male artists, and I think the women here in the United States would make him one of their great favorites.
Mr. Royal, when was it that the television started in the United States?
Well, it first started back around 1939 when the World's Fair was on, and then the war came along and caused it to be postponed until after the war, and then after the war it was picked up at 1945 and has been progressing rapidly ever since. I wish that we had Mr. Gardel in our television here now.
I spoke with Mr. Eden Dunham, who was the director of his programs, and he told that one of the factors that had influence in Gardel's not being a tremendous hit, let's say, was because at that time the programs by vocalists were made once a week or twice a week. Do you think is that correct?
No, I don't think that that is the real reason. Mr. Gardell came at a time when we had two networks. One was sold out completely, the red network, and then our open time was on the blue network. It takes several months to get the program schedule so arranged that the repeat performances make an artist popular throughout the country. This is a very big country, and we would only sell to an advertiser 13 programs to be sure that he would get the right results. Well, Mr. Gardell could not afford the time to stay here very long, and he had to leave to go back to his country before we could get him as popular as he deserved to be. Mr. Gardell, if he had come back again to our city and our country, I'm sure would have become as big as Jolson or any other artist we ever had.
Now that you mentioned the 13 weeks contract, and you mentioned also that Gardell had to leave, I read in the press sheets of NBC that when Gardell announced his last program on the radio, thousands of letters started to come into NBC. Now that I understand made him change his mind, and he stayed for one more month. Now let me ask you, Mr. Royal, those letters were by Spanish-speaking fans or by Americans also as well?
Well, by all people in this country. There is no one group in this country regarding talent. All the listeners liked Mr. Gardell, and they were just getting to know him. Of course, the Spanish listeners loved him because they knew him better than the Americans. And out in Texas and in California and the state of Minnesota, which is a long way off, we had letters from such states, and it takes a little while to cover the country. And that is what's happening when he was leaving. It's about when he should have been starting.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask you, now that we talked about the TV, do you think that if Gardell could have made pictures in English for Paramount, as he was supposed to do when coming back of his tour for Latin America, do you think that those pictures would have made him a world-famous artist, like Chevaliers today, Al Jolson?
They would help, but he was a great artist without pictures. We've had great artists in the world long before we had pictures. Some were made popular or famous by records, but it only needed time in this country or any country for Mr. Gardell to have become a tremendous figure, because he was a tremendous figure in himself. He had the talent and the personality and the God gift to make himself a great artist wherever he was.
Now that you mentioned he was a great artist, I remember what you told me in another conversation interview we had, that here in America you had such great artists as Judy Garland, Ray Valley, Al Jolson, and you made a comparison saying that Gardell was like them, one of those artists that come one in a thousand. Is that correct, Mr.?
Great artists are universal. They belong to the world. They don't belong to any one country. They're citizens of the world, and they share their talents wherever they go. There are no borders or frontiers on nationalism regarding talent. Our country has been blessed with some great artists, and Mr. Gardell would have been a part of that group if he had remained here. We've had in South America, you've had two wonderful artists down there, Mr. Gardel, and at present you have in Mexico Mr. Cantinflas, who's another great artist, of course, of a different sort. In South America, you've had some fine opera singers who have come to this country and have had tremendous success at the Metropolitan Opera House, for which we're very, very glad. And the one thing that doesn't need any politics is talent and artistry, and for which we're all very pleased and happy.
Mr. Royal, you told me in a previous conversation that prior to the Roosevelt's policy of good neighbor, you had help here on NBC bringing over here such great artists as Pedro Vargas, Agustin Lara from Latin America.
Shortly after coming to the National Broadcasting Company, I realized that no one country could supply enough talent for radio and then later on for television, that we would have to go elsewhere to get the great artists. And it was my pleasure to have brought wonderful artists from Latin America, because I felt that this exchange of talent would lend itself to a better understanding. And I recall in 1935, it may have been 36, when visiting the Argentine with President Roosevelt, I had a long talk with Mr. Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State and who I think was the originator of the so-called good neighbor policy. And we had a long discussion at that time about the exchange of talent, that people could get to know each other better by the singing of the music from the different countries. Now, the music from all the South American countries is as well known in the United States as it probably is in the towns and cities where it was originally written. Science has made it possible for us to keep a record either on films or on tape recording of the great artists of the world. It's unfortunate that Jenny Lind and many of the older artists of the other days have not been saved for posterity. I can tell you that quite frequently at home I play some of Mr. Gardel's old recordings, and some of them have been reissued. Now, the actual mechanical recordings are not quite as good as the improved recordings of today, but the man's great talent is quite obvious, and it's a great pleasure for me to sit at home, either alone or with friends, and to play back the songs by this fabulous man from the Argentine.
Now that you have mentioned the records, Mr. Royal, in Latin America is actually amazing how his records are selling today. They are selling even more than yesterday, and as I told you also, they play them on programs throughout Latin America. I remember in Dominican Republic, they had a 1 hour program of Gardel's records on Sunday, and later they made it in 2 hours. And of course in Argentina and Chile, Uruguay, Peru, his popularity is great. Also he has programs in Venezuela. Throughout Latin America, he's very well remembered yet.
He'll always be remembered. You cannot forget great talent, whether it's in the entertainment world or the literary world or the political world. Talent is talent, and it's to be remembered. I had one idea that unfortunately never materialized. Mr. Gardel's songs were principally of the tango tempo, and while he was here, I had an idea that perhaps it would be worthwhile if I could get him together with Augustin Lara of Mexico, who I think is such a great composer, and the combination of Augustin Lara's music and Gardell's talent would have been something quite worthwhile to look forward to, but unfortunately that didn't come off.
Yes, I also think that would have been a wonderful combination and display of talent, but unfortunately, as you say, that couldn't realize. Mr. Royal, it's been very nice talking here with you in your office about Carlos Gardel, and I appreciate the time you have given me for this interview. Thank you very much. Esta es una entrevista que tuve en el día de anteayer, septiembre 26 de 1961, con el señor John Royal, quien ocupa hoy uno de los cargos más importantes en la NBC de Nueva York, que es la más grande red de broadcasting de los Estados Unidos, si no del mundo entero. Esta entrevista pasará a formar parte de mi colección sobre Carlos Gardel, y muy pronto espero engrosarla con otras que haré a Eric Tucci, Carlos Espaventa y al señor Alberto Riesling, quien es cónsul general del Uruguay en Nueva York y que fuera gran amigo de Carlos Gardel durante su estadía en esta ciudad. Si Gardel no es hoy una figura de mucho renombre en Estados Unidos, no es porque le faltaran talento ni condiciones. Ya me lo había dicho el señor Royal en una entrevista previa, que cuando Gardel vino a cantar a la NBC, él era un éxito, el público no lo fue. En otras palabras, el público de Estados Unidos no estaba preparado para él. Unos años más tarde hubiera conquistado Norteamérica, éxito que hubiera sido apuntalado de una forma aplastante si Gardel hubiera comenzado a hacer películas en inglés como su contrato con Paramount lo estipulaba. Pero hay quienes reconocen talento sin la necesidad de la mayor o menor difusión o publicidad que el artista tenga. Y uno de ellos es el señor Royal. Y cuando él nos dice que Gardel era un artista extraordinario de proyecciones universales, sus palabras son las de un gran juez de talento artístico, aquel que conociera y contratara para NBC a los artistas más grandes y talentosos del mundo entero. Y Gardel es verdaderamente un artista universal. Su arte está y estará siempre de actualidad. Al contrario de muchos otros cantantes, su estilo no pertenecía a una época. Su estilo, su expresión, su decir son eternos, porque él también lo es.